What is the evidence for Jesus outside of the New Testament? How reliable are accounts of Jesus in Josephus and Tacitus? And what do they contribute to our understanding of the historical Jesus? Our guest today, Dr. Gary Habermas, is arguably the foremost authority on the resurrection of Jesus and has written extensively on this topic. Gary, I'm looking forward to having you out to Biola to speak to our master students this summer. And I noticed you wore red because you're coming out to Biola soon.
Yeah, that's the reason. Do you have a little bit of black in it or not?
I'm just messing with you. No worries at all. Well, we're gonna jump into your thoughts on the evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible. And I'm really curious.
Okay.
You've been studying this since the 70s. How would you say scholarly discussion about Jesus outside the Bible has shifted in that 4 decades plus?
Well, that's a loaded question, and for a number of reasons. Back in the 70s, F.F. Bruce had written a book on Jesus outside the New Testament, and he was one of the only ones who had commented on this. And then a few years later, R.T. France, Dick France, who was a professor of New Testament, British professor at what is now London School of Theology, wrote a book on the evidence for Jesus. And I came along. A few others wrote. A few Catholic scholars did books, but there weren't a lot. And I came along and I wrote a manuscript. It's kind of a cute story. The publisher sent it to F.F. Bruce, and he was one of the outside reviewers. And they said, "What do you think about this?" And he wrote comments that were beautiful. And they sent me a copy of what he said.
Wow.
And Bruce said, and he's got a book on it already. And he said, "This is great stuff." He literally said, I've got it in my file. He literally said, "This is the best I've ever seen. I'd recommend you publish it." All right. So the company said, the cute thing is, not giving myself a compliment, the cuter story is how we are as humans. The publisher, Thomas Nelson, said, "Would you do the foreword for the book?" And he said, "I'd be glad to." And when he wrote it, it was not that rosy.
Oh.
It was not everything wonderful. I mean, it was good. It was a good review.
Sure.
But it wasn't just, "Oh, wow, this is really good." A capable job, like that. And,
Gotcha.
And then he made a comment at the end. I wouldn't have discussed the Shroud of Turin. So,
well, we're gonna get to the Shroud of Turin.
It's changed a little. A couple of things.
Go ahead.
Van Voorst wrote a book, and with Erdmans. It's probably the best one out right now. Jesus outside the New Testament.
Okay. So would you say, is there more confidence in the historical Jesus sources outside of the Bible than there was in the 70s? Or has scholarship moved towards more skepticism on those?
What if I said there's more agreement and a lot of attestation from these sources, but many scholars, if not most, don't give a rip? And they don't because they think, yeah, these are good, but the best sources, you got to kind of hang on to your chair here. The best sources are in the New Testament, and Paul in particular. So you have the Jesus mythers saying, "Nah, you can't use the New Testament. That's prejudice. Christians talking about Christians." And here's the atheist and agnostic and skeptical New Testament scholars like Bart Ehrman saying, "I'm sorry, but the New Testament is a very good book. Depending on who you're using, Paul is the best." And that's where it is now. So the secular sources are secondary, but the best ones are not disputed.
Okay. Why do you think there's not more evidence for Jesus outside the Bible? I often hear from skeptics or critics that if this really happened, we should have way more sources. So what would you say to that claim?
Yeah, they're really overestimating how many scholars were writing in those days and how many would say more than a paragraph. Most of the extra biblical sources on Jesus, it would surprise people. We have more than a dozen. and they're usually a half a sentence. If you've got a paragraph, you're tearing it up. That's a great source. But they'll let the half a sentence, and that goes. Those are good texts. But you're not going to get more for a bunch of reasons. One is there aren't that many scholars. Secondly, Israel was a very obscure place. Thirdly, many people didn't like the Jews and didn't care anything they were doing and didn't pay attention to them. And I would think some people in the Roman Empire, take Suetonius, his 12 Caesars, some of these guys, they're emperor worshipers. And they most likely didn't want to talk about somebody that went across against their own religion. But I think for most people, I would say, hey, don't ignore the 15, even though they're briefer than we might like.
So a minute ago, you said 12, and then you said 15. Are you referring to non-Christian sources within like the first 2 or 3 centuries? Give us the scope.
Look, if you're going to let me go 2 or 3 centuries, I'll have far more than that.
Okay.
But here's why I change. Bart Ehrman counts sources for Jesus 100 years after the crucifixion. Now, he dates the crucifixion to 30 AD, so he's going to go sources up to 130 AD.
Okay.
When I did my book, The Historical Jesus, the one that F.F. Bruce was talking about, I do 150 years after Jesus. There's no rule how much you could use or not use, but I used 150 years later, and if you say 2 or 3 centuries, I'm going to pick up a lot. But when I did 150 years later, I believe I had 17 sources or potential sources for Jesus. So 17, almost a dozen and a half.
And these are all non-Christian sources. Is that what you refer to?
Absolutely. Non-Christian sources are in a few cases archaeology, which doesn't come with belief or unbelief, etc.
Okay. Could you give us a broad sense of the different kind of sources, maybe within that window that you're talking about? So these could be Gnostic sources. These could be church fathers. These could be Jewish sources. Like if you're going to lay out for somebody what evidence we have outside of Jesus, what are some of these big sources within that 150 years?
All right, let me start with the secular ones. There is a dialogue that's been published by InterVarsity, and they talk, I believe, to 5 scholars on what we can know about the historical Jesus. One is an evangelical, and that's Darrell Bach, and the others are all critical scholars. You're talking everyone from Bob Price, who leans toward Jesus never lived. He's one of only 2, as Bart Ehrman counts them, 2 well-accredited scholars who take that view. You've got John Dominic Crossan, sadly the late, we need a scholarship, James D.G. Dunn, and Luke Timothy Johnson, and then, of course, one evangelical out of 5. And here's where they all agreed. They all agreed, maybe even Bob Price, the mythicist, would agree that the best sources are Tacitus and Josephus, the 2 you already mentioned.
Okay.
They're the best. But here's just one example. Bart Ehrman gives about 15 sources for the crucifixion in the first 100 years. 15 different sources. Most of them are in the New Testament. But he also counts the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, Josephus, Tacitus. That gives you 4. Plus, he thinks the second 6 Pauline epistles are Deutero-Pauline. So those would actually be they would essentially be non-canonical voices. They're in the canon, but they're essentially don't count. So that would mean half of his sources are not cited the same way conservatives do. Oh, by the way, if you want some Gnostic sources besides Peter doesn't appear to be Gospel of Peter doesn't appear to be Gnostic. Thomas, there's 3 kinds of saints in Thomas. Some Gnostic ones, some Orthodox ones, and some odd ones. I mean, really odd ones. Like scratch a tree, scratch the bark, and you will find me there. So, that's kind of crazy. But there are other ones. The Gospel of Truth, if you go a little bit further than 100 years, the Gospel of Truth, Treatise on Resurrection, you'd have to put those in there. So there's a few Gnostic sources as you get out toward 150. And if you go all the way to 150, which is only 120 years, now you've got Just a Martyr, and he's huge. He is. And you've got a couple others with fragments or just small amounts. So we've got a good group.
So if we're talking about what we can know about Jesus historically speaking, what value would you put in those Gnostic Gospels or Gnostic sources within that window?
I assume you mean historical value.
Historical value.
And, excuse me. Virtually nobody counts them for anything.
Okay.
What they're going to say is these are theological books grinding the Gnostic acts, and they're not even talking about history as a general rule. They're talking about truth and what we can know in what we now call a Gnostic sense. Now, somebody could say, well, that's a New Testament sources too. They're grinding in Acts. Right. First of all, it's the mythers who usually say that. They're generally not accredited New Testament scholars. They're not trained that way. Carrier and Price are examples. Are exceptions. But you've got very few who are going to count anything from the Gnostic books. Now, you get to Paul, though, in the New Testament. Critics will let the 7 books of Paul go. You are free to quote the 7 books of Paul. And now those are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians. Then you've got Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Those 7, you can cite them. And I would say if you're a pastor giving a series on the best Pauline sources, they're going to be the books you're going to use. They're really good ones. 1 Thessalonians is probably the earliest, about 50 AD. So they're great sources. And let me make this last point. You can use Paul. They don't think Paul is inspired.
Sure.
But they do think he's a good scholar. Paul basically had a PhD in Old Testament.
Okay.
And he's a good scholar. He's an eyewitness. And as Ehrman says, he knew the guys who were the eyewitnesses and he interviewed them.
Okay.
So you can cite Paul all you want. They don't have to agree with you, but they'll largely agree with you.
So we've got the Gospels, we got the source of Paul, we have these Gnostic Gospels and texts that actually offer minimal historical value. What historical value for those who are trying to get behind the Jesus of faith to the Jesus of history, so to speak, would other Christian sources outside of the Bible play? So, right, Ignatius or Clement of Rome within the window that you're talking about. Maybe we're brushing up towards like Polycarp. How helpful are these sources for the historical Jesus?
Those are very helpful. And I'll tell you why. Bart Ehrman's going to count them because they're going to go up to because they go up to 130 AD. So they're within his 100 years. He's up to 130 AD. Let me give some dates. If John is the oldest gospel at about 95, you've got Clement perhaps written the same year. He may be the same Clement mentioned by Paul, and he is written about 95 AD. Okay, you've got Ignatius about 107, and Polycarp about 110. That means that Clement and Polycarp maximum are about 10 years after the Gospel of John. Papias is often dated about 125. Those dates are starting to switch around a little bit now on Papias, but he's often dated as at 125. And I know a New Testament scholar, one of the best in the country, who, if I remember correctly, did his master's thesis on the date for Papias and argued that it should be 110 AD, the same as Polycarp. Unfortunately, his major work that everybody would give an arm and a leg to get it, the exposition of the oracles of the Lord, it's wonderful, only exists in fragments.
Okay, so you already mentioned the crucifixion, but if we were going to talk about what historical kind of facts we can ascertain without the Gospels or the New Testament, just from the church fathers, what are some of the key historical truths that we could kind of garner related to the historical Jesus? Obviously, the crucifixion, you've got Tacitus and Josephus mention that. What are some other details we could know from these sources that you trust that are non-Christian in that window?
Yeah, if you want to go from about John 95 to Papias about 125, you can get a couple other things, a couple other ones also in fragments. One of them reports Jesus' miracles and says that Jesus was that the followers who saw the miracles were still alive, and that might make you want to put that one back a bit in time. But they record, for example, Clement 95 A.D. He talks about a very important passage. He talks about the Jesus appearing to the disciples, and he showed himself to them, and because of the resurrection, they were able to take that information and what I call set out on the yellow brick road that leads you to the Emerald City. So Christians would take the resurrection of Jesus all the way to heaven, and the resurrection was the reason. And Clement's comment is like Paul's, where Paul says, we take this and we give it to other men, and they can give it to others and make them faithful people. Hebrews says we learn first from the prophets, then from the apostles, and lastly it's come down to us and we give it to you. That chain of command, Clement says that. And he says we learned it from Jesus. Jesus told the apostle told us, and here's the truth. So there are about a half dozen to 8 passages in Clement, Ignatius, and Polycarp by 110 AD. You can throw a couple fragments of
Papias in there.
Papias in there, and what he says about Mark, for example, very valuable. You can throw those in there, and we have about getting close to 10 what we could call historical passages that tell us things about Jesus, and almost always they zero in on the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus, what we call the gospel.
Are you aware of any historical facts that contradict the Gospels and the New Testament in Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, and the Papias fragments, just on the historical details, not theology? Can you think of any that seem to contradict, or they just support it?
No, critics could come in there and say, and they could pick a passage that you've read 100 times, but you never thought of it from this other angle. And they could say, that could be a disagreement, but there's no major passage in there that everybody's going to sit on and say this is a loser. Can't use it.
That's helpful. So you're working on this 4-volume, I believe 5,000-word life tome on the resurrection. What role will this evidence for Jesus outside the Bible play in that larger case that you're making?
I hope it'll get us a good start. In volume number 1, which I've already turned down, turned in, it's already been edited. It's almost 1,100 pages.
Wow.
And it starts with about 175 pages of historiography. What is history? What's a definition of miracle? How do we do historical research? What's the difference between philosophy of history and historiography? How do you actually get events in the ancient world? There's almost no ancient historians that tell us how to do history. Lucian and Cicero a little bit, but these guys don't major on what we would call theoretical things, philosophy of history or historiography. But I do have a chapter on these sources that we're talking about right now. What can we know about Jesus from history? I have a chapter on a definition of miracle, which is a very difficult topic. It could easily be a master's thesis just to do a definition of miracle. And so the question, did Jesus exist, obviously is in there. And I also do, before I start resurrection, I do the question, was Jesus a healer? And was he an exorcist? Because today, almost all critical scholars believe Jesus was an exorcist and a healer. And you can say, well, how can they believe he's an exorcist if they don't believe in demons? Okay, and there's this distinction among scholars that people miss. I had two well-known evangelical guys do it this week, and I had to say, whoa, 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 stop, guys. Look what's going on here. They're not telling you that they believe these things happened.
Right.
They're telling you they believe the New Testament writers believe they happened. So, was Jesus a healer? Well, definitely. He definitely healed people. Even today, we send people to psychologists, to counselors, and we know psychosomatic illnesses can be healed. We know that cognitive theory, I know a buddy who teaches it in an obviously accredited medical school, teaches cognitive theory. And we know it heals people by changing what you say to yourself and so on. However, Jesus healed, and they'll raise that question. Was Jesus getting them to, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. He gives this healthy psychosomatic teaching that will get people on the right trail to get them thinking the right way about God. And so Jesus really healed. And what they mean by that is either the cases as they are, mostly the synoptics, there's only 7 miracles in John, either the cases in the synoptics and the few in John, many of those actually happened, or ones just like them happened. So that's what they mean by Jesus healer. It really happened. And you go, but you don't believe in demons. Right, but you didn't ask me that question. You asked me, what do I think happened? And they can't explain all that because they didn't have modern medicine. But yes, Jesus did things that today we would make movies about and call casting out the devil, And so they think those things happened. And I read a critic recently who said it's unanimous. It's not, but he just overdid it a little bit. And he said it's unanimous among critical scholars that Jesus was a healer and an exorcist.
Wow.
Very few of them believe he did the nature miracles. Those are the calmed the storm, so on. John Dominic Crossan says the chief nature miracle was the resurrection. So they don't, but the two guys who've written the longest treatments of miracle in the New Testament, Graham Twelfthtree, an Australian who teaches at the school that we mentioned earlier, Richard France.
Oh, R.T. France, yeah.
Same school, London School of Theology. He's got 500 pages on the healing miracles and exorcism of Jesus. Another guy who unfortunately just passed away, John Meyer, wrote the Marginal Jew, 4 big volumes, and he has almost 500 pages on the miracles of healing. Now, Meyer is not as conservative as Twelfthtree, but Twelfthtree thinks that around about 70% of the claims in the Gospels, those events happened. Now, he believes they really happened. And Meyer doesn't really put the numbers in there, but he's about 50%. So if you take all the cases in the Gospels, even John Meyer says 50% of them happened. And they both say this: just because the rest of them aren't evidenced does not mean the rest of them didn't happen.
Wow,
those could all happen, us just not have data. And that's a very important distinction to make.
That's a great distinction. Now, since we're talking about extra biblical evidence for Jesus, give me the latest on the shroud. I know we could do a whole show on this, but tell me just your latest thoughts and beliefs about where the evidence stands. And I'd be curious if you're going to include that in your recent tome on the resurrection.
Okay, I'm going to make some people angry. I co-authored a couple of books of the shroud. My co-author was one of the scientists who did the investigation in 1978, the famous investigation.
Wow.
So in interviews, they expect me to say, absolutely, this is true. And I'll say, the talk show host will say, where do you put the percentage? And I'll say, 80%. I said, no, and 80% is a C on my exams. So, I mean, for some people, that's not a great grade. But I think in history, 80 is pretty good. And I said, I'll give it about an 80. Well, then I start getting emails. I thought you were pro-shroud. I thought, yeah. And so to answer your question, strike 2, I did not put it in my first volume. The first volume is on evidence. I didn't put it on there. I'm not sad I didn't. I think I made the right decision. But I'm sad I'm not really allowed to talk about it. Now, the editor, Brahman Holman, the academic, they were happy. They didn't care if I put it in. They said, "You go ahead. You want to put it in there? Do it." But I don't, because a lot of scholars have not studied the shroud and have not
Okay.
looked at the data, and so they go, "That's a bunch of bogus idol
Hmm.
hunters or this and that," and they just rule it out without looking. And I thought,
Hmm.
I'm not going to I'm not going to prejudice 1,100 pages of historical evidence for the Jesus resurrection in Volume 1 and let them take away from it with an appendix,
Hmm.
which is where it would have gone on the Shroud of Turin. So I did not. I mentioned it several times to say it's a possibility, but I didn't put it in there.
So it's less the evidence against it, but more of a strategic move in terms of what you're wanting to advance with the volume that you left it out and the potential
Yeah.
baggage that would come with it.
Yeah, it has
As
to be, because I've done 2 co-authored books on it, and I've done a bunch of articles. Hey, I just did an article on it for a magazine. I mean, like a month ago. I just
hmm,
did the article, and it got picked up by 2 news services. My article did. So what I mean is, these are decent sources. So there, people who get into it know there's some things to be said, and they know a lot of their readers want to hear it. So those are 2 reasons they do it. But if they thought it was a bunch of garbage, they would have said so, and I don't think that
sure.
gets said very often.
So I was reading your book on ancient evidence for the life of Jesus, I think in mid
Right.
90s or so. And in there you
Yep.
say the shroud is evidence, it could be a piece of evidence for the death and resurrection. Now,
Right.
I feel like I may be missing something. At most, it could be evidence, it seems, that Jesus died, arguably that the tomb was empty. But the
Yep.
only piece that gets us to a resurrection is you made a statement in there. We don't know how the body was removed. There seems to be a mystery how the body was removed and this was preserved. Now, that might move us toward some possible supernatural component, but still, it just could be a natural phenomenon we don't understand. So, at best, it seems to be part of a larger case for the resurrection that would get the death, burial of Jesus, but it doesn't get us to something supernatural, right?
Let me back up. You need to do an historical epistemic argument to even get to Jesus, to even get the death of the burial. You have to argue that of the thousands of people in history who were not crucified, some loser was either not crucified. You have to argue that it couldn't be a guy who just happened to be crucified the same way Jesus was, because thousands were crucified outside Jerusalem alone by the
Okay.
Romans, or a person that they made it up and did to a captive, a prisoner they hated, and they did the exact same thing to him that was done to Jesus. So you have to get around that objection. But I think it can be gotten around. The reason I say possible for the resurrection is, you're right, it would fit along with a larger case. I actually had a debate on this in Jets
Hmm.
years ago with 2 philosophers, and I defended how it could be, how it could warrant being in Jets for the historical reasons alone. And if you want me to give you the reasons, I can. I can give you 2 or 3 reasons that would
Sure.
point to resurrection. I don't
Yeah.
think it establishes resurrection. That's why
Okay.
I'm only at 80. That's why I'm at
Yeah.
80%
Give us a couple. Maybe you don't have to give the whole case, but maybe 2 points you think are interesting.
for resurrection. Okay, if if it's an actual artifact and the scientists are agreed, um, and if it's a crucified man, that's part of that deal. Yes. And if we have the data on there, by the way, many pathologists have said that we have enough data on the shroud to tell you how the guy died.
Hmm.
In fact, Sean, I'll tell you, my research used to be my TA, but my research assistant's got a PhD now, Ben Shaw, and a medical doctor, MD, PhD, from Texas Tech. The 3 of us wrote an article for Baylor University Medical School on what the predominant view is among medical doctors.
Hmm.
And asphyxiation is more than double all the other views put together.
Okay.
Okay, now the resurrection. Um, the man buried in the shroud, the predominant view, obviously not believed by everybody, but the predominant view is that the image on the shroud is radiation from a dead body.
Okay.
Now, once you say that, you're going to have friends and foes, and they're going to be ready to fight right off the bat. But if there's radiation from a dead body, measurable radiation that has stood a bunch of tests in scientific labs. Okay, that's one. A couple other points. When you look at the man's face in the shroud, underneath the lips are little, all the way across, what look like teeth. There's some up here too. They think they've got, those proponents think they've got a couple dozen. The teeth, whatever, if it is radiation, and if it came out through the inside out, what you have is this process brought the teeth out, the image of the teeth with it onto the cloth. Now, what procedure is going to bring teeth marks? These aren't wounds. These are teeth, even roots, according to some experts who are not shroudies. And so if you have teeth there, the fingers are very, very long. And they thought, well, this guy had Marfan syndrome like Abraham Lincoln did, and extremely long fingers. Well, now they start looking at this data, and nobody's talking Marfans anymore, because they think that on the hand, whoever it is, what you're looking at are the bones, the hand bones inside the hand. So once again, you're talking radiation. So from hands and teeth, you're talking about a process. Now, the man in the shroud is dead. There's about a half dozen reasons to believe he's dead. Okay. So you don't have a swoon theory. You got a dead man, and something is coming out of him. And Christians would probably say, at precisely the moment he had to still be dead, or people would say swoon, and before he finally he opens his eyes and gets up and walks off the slab there in the tomb and lays his grave clothes aside. So it's very, there's some intriguing things here. At least, and I put it at 80. 80's not a great score, and it makes a lot of people upset. But I just had a debate. It's on my website. I just debated a guy who was an anti. He used to be pro-shroud. He was pretty well known, and now he's anti. We debated, and I gave 10 arguments for this being Jesus and for the mark being radiation. And he'd been debating recently and kind of whipping a few of the pro-shroud experts. I just started with these 10 reasons, and when he got the chance to talk, he said, "Whoa, I haven't heard 10 reasons lined up like that." Usually somebody mentions one or two, but there's a lot there.
Okay, so the key point is that this body was dead, and then the way it's preserved shows radiation, which would not naturally have been coming after that season of death, and preserves that moment, arguably, right as Jesus was being resurrected. Did I sum that up fairly?
Yeah, that's good. And I used to say in my early lectures on the shroud a couple dozen years ago, I would say, we're not sure. I say we, because I co-authored it with this guy in the research. If light came down or light came out, we don't know which way the light went. Okay. And I was doing that lecture, and there was a medical doctor sitting right there, like in the second row, and he goes, whoa, go back to that picture of the face. And I did. He goes, look at those teeth up there. He says, obviously, I've looked at x-rays all my life. Those are teeth right there. He said, I can answer your question for you. It didn't come down from on top, or the teeth wouldn't be in it. It had to come out from what's on the inside. Something's going on in this person and coming out.
Okay.
And if they're x-rays of the teeth.
All right. If folks want to know more, they can go to that. I'll try to link it below. Let's shift to two of the historians you said are some of the most significant, one being Tacitus, who's been called the greatest historian of ancient Rome. Before we get into what he wrote, maybe tell us a little bit of who he was and why he is so significant for the historical Jesus.
Well, he is called, if he's not called the best, he's put up there with the best.
Okay.
And one reason is his writing. His writing is very serious. Okay, if you compare him to a colleague, Suetonius, who wrote about the same time, 118 to 120 AD, about not quite 100 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Suetonius records a number of supernatural things, omens. A Caesar is walking around and a crow or a raven flies in the window and he says it's an omen. I'm going to be dying soon. And wouldn't you know it, 3 days later he died. So there's that stuff in there. There's prophecies. Vespasian was said to have done some healing miracles. And these are recorded. Tacitus is much more careful. And now, I tell people, miracles can happen. We have them today. I mean, there are an incredible number of sources that list thousands of miracles today, and some of them are pre and post X-ray, CAT scan, MRI, and so they may happen. I'm just saying Tacitus gains points by being subdued, by not doing a lot of supernatural things, and he seemed to be more serious and not giving. I mean, Suetonius. His name of his book is 12 Caesars. And when you look at the table of contents, on 5 of the 12 Caesars, it says, later deified, later deified, later deified. There's 5 strikes against you right now because he's saying the 5 Caesars are God. So he's got to be careful what he says, and he's got these signs all over the place. Tacitus is just more careful. They like that. Oh, very important thing. Tacitus had clearance to check Roman records out in Rome. He was sort of like a Josephus was too, but Josephus wrote earlier. Tacitus, like Josephus, was a bit of a court historian, had access to the best Roman records.
Okay, so let's talk about what Tacitus refers to. Obviously, there's the famous passage in the Annals in which he refers to Christians just being tortured and the fire in Rome and the crucifixion of Jesus. Walk through what we basically can ascertain about Jesus from Tacitus and maybe why you think that is a reliable source.
Well, because of what I already said about Tacitus, having Roman sources and being very conservative in what he reports and not going all over the place and just bragging about the emperors like crazy because he doesn't want to get in trouble because he's not recognizing them as God or gods. But on top of all that, he's got the major passages, this paragraph. And what he says is there was this man named Jesus, and he was crucified in Jerusalem under Pontius Pilate. And I believe he says while Tiberius was Caesar.
He does. That's right.
And so that's good. And he's giving the data. And then he shifts from, by the way, both he and Suetonius say that when Jesus died, they say the movement broke out again after his death. No explanation, just, we thought we had the fire put out, but here comes the fire again. And Christians would say, whoa, that might be the resurrection. We don't know, but something's coming up there. Well, then Tacitus kind of shifts. He uses the crucifixion is an example to say that when the great fire in Rome took place, and kind of more or less implies that Nero was the culprit here, but he rounded up a bunch of Christians and crucified them and then used their bodies as torches in the night, whether it's the Appian Way or, like Spartacus and so on.
Sure.
So their bodies were used for a political purpose. And Tacitus says the people took compassion on the Christians because of the unfair way they had been treated. But he's not happy. Tacitus calls it a mischievous doctrine. So he's not, it broke out again, but it's mischievous. He's not, either he's expected to say that, he thinks. I doubt it's that. I doubt he really was bothered by what they stood for and what they were claiming.
So you have pretty good degree of confidence in Tacitus. Does the wider scholarly community tend to accept this passage in particular as a reference to Jesus, or are there a lot of skeptical voices within the scholarly community?
Not many. In this dialogue I told you about, where Dom Crossan and Jimmy Dunn and Luke Timothy Johnson besides Darrell Bach, when they get to do their response to Bob Price, the mythicist, they tell him, if I remember correctly, it's Crossan and Johnson, Luke Timothy Johnson, who say, and I there's no question Dunn would have jumped in here, but those guys say Tacitus and Josephus are the sources we have. And if I remember correctly, Crossan says about the death of Jesus. Now, he says in another work, he says, I take it absolutely for granted that Jesus died by crucifixion. But in this dialogue, he says, that can be established from Josephus and Tacitus alone. So if somebody says you got to use these objective sources outside the gospel, untainted by Christians, he says, we got plenty right here with these two. And the guys in the book are very positive toward Tacitus and Josephus.
Okay, so let's shift towards Josephus. Maybe talk a little bit about who he is and what he contributed to the historical Jesus.
Okay, he was a Jewish historian, and of course he writes the story of the Jews. But when the Romans came to town, it wasn't just Jerusalem. They were elsewhere, and in the Jewish War, 66 to 70 A.D., a lot of people were crucified outside of Jerusalem. And I'll just add as a footnote, a lot of people think only men were crucified. We actually read in the ancient sources that women and children were crucified.
Holy cow.
Now, I would think that Josephus making the point that we ran out of wood for the bodies would be probably a sign that they would be less likely to take children if they, because they wanted to make this, they wanted people to look down from the city and this to be a lesson to them. And of course that would bother them that they're crucifying children. But if they're killing their commanders, and this guy was your big hero, look right now, he's not so big now, is he? I just think that would be something for the males. But they crucified, and in other cities too. Now, there's a famous story in the life of Josephus where he finds three of his friends, and he goes and talks to the commander and tells him, hey, these are buddies of mine. If you take them down, I'd sure appreciate it. And they took the three down. He commanded that they got the best of Roman medical attention, and two of them still died. So only one lived, even being taken down prematurely. So that's in Josephus. He was an eyewitness, is what I'm saying. He was there. He witnessed it. And he got to be good friends with the Romans. They started trusting him. One time they had a cohort, Josephus says, of 1,000 men who went with him to another city. And they sent all these soldiers with him. I'm just saying he was appreciated among them.
Okay.
And then he moved to Rome, and he became court historian for the Romans. So they recognized him, and that's why a lot of Jews hated him, because they thought he was a turncoat, kind of a Benedict Arnold.
So in your book on the ancient evidence for life of Jesus, you say that most scholars accept this kind of interpolated, shorter version of the Testimonium Flavianum, in which we get the reference to the crucifixion of Jesus, that some considered him the Messiah, etc. Do you still hold that position, and why?
I think, well, Charlesworth, who just retired from Princeton, Charlesworth, if I remember correctly, said that the majority view on Josephus is that paragraph is his, with possibly those three major exceptions. He was a worker of miracles. He was perhaps the Messiah, and his resurrection. But as many people have pointed out, he doesn't say he did miracles, doesn't say he was the Messiah, didn't say he was raised from the dead. For example, in the latter example, Josephus says, and his followers taught that he was raised from the dead, which, me doing this minimal facts argument for the resurrection, these critique that all scholars will accept today, that's exactly what they allow, that the New Testament writers say he appeared to them alive afterwards. That seems to be Josephus's point, and is backed up by the evidence. Plus, there's another version of Josephus, an Arabic version that showed up a couple decades ago, and it makes those lesser claims. Some say he did miracles. Some say he was the Messiah. Some say they saw him again. So it's pretty good argument. By the way, a real brief one, Sean, is that a lot of scholars say there had to be a previous mention of Josephus, because later Josephus says that James was, I guess we could say pastor of the Church of Jerusalem, James, a brother of Jesus, and he tells how James was killed, and he makes the comment, James, the brother of the so-called Christ. And to say that, scholars say, you don't just say that. Who's the so-called Christ? Tell us something. So it assumes that Josephus said something earlier before that little standalone comment about James's martyrdom.
Now, one of the criticisms that's made of this passage is that the manuscripts of Josephus were preserved just by Christians, which would allow for interpolation in the very passages that we're referring to. And we have no sources outside of this. Do you find that convincing?
I mean, not very much. For one thing, I'll beef that up a little bit. Origen seems not to know those passages, because he doesn't cite the most laudatory ones of Jesus. So it's thought that they weren't there when Origen lived, which is going to be, quite a ways after Justin Martyr, who we've already listed by 150. But so they may not have been there. But I would say the problem here is, if you say Josephus didn't do anything, you still have the reference to James. And this is where Charles Worth, at the very least, I think, would say you could remove those three phrases and still have a very substantial paragraph that would tell us about Jesus. Then later his brother was stoned, being basically the pastor in Jerusalem. So we have enough information right there. It's a full paragraph in Josephus, the Flavianum. It's very important material. And then you got the whole paragraph in Tacitus. And I started out the program saying, if a lot of these references are a half a sentence or a sentence, Tacitus and Josephus are two of the longest. So that's more valuable to us if we think it's accredited.
The Origen reference is interesting because he mentions Josephus at least 11 times, but doesn't mention the testimonium at all. And the argument is made that in Contracelsus, it would have seemingly benefited him to cite that very passage in places where he's affirming the historicity of Jesus by referring to other contemporaries of the time. For example, he'll cite Origen texts from Josephus in the testimonium about John the Baptist and James, the brother of Jesus, but doesn't cite the testimonium itself. So other passages that are close to that within Josephus, but not the testimonium. So the argument is made that Origen does cite Josephus, and in places where it would have benefited him, he doesn't include the testimonium. Therefore, it likely wasn't there in the original. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I'll make it even worse. Now, Celsus was a skeptical philosopher. So that would have been, everybody knows, skeptical philosophers are guys you want to have good arguments for, because they're going to be good. They're going to have good comebacks. But much earlier with Justin Martyr, he's got his famous dialogue with Trypho, the Jew. Now, people are not decided whether Trypho was an actually existent person or if it was the kind of arguments they heard from Jews in those days. But sure. Justin also does not use it with Trypho, who's a Jew, who you would love to say, this fulfills your Old Testament scriptures. What do you say now? And so I'm willing to say those three passages, it'd be a little bit radical, but I'm willing to say that the three passages, take them. If you want them, take them. But if your point is that they evidence Jesus, we've got two good scholars here who give you a paragraph. It's a lot of material. Neither one of them believed in Jesus. Tacitus was not a bit happy with them. And we've got others. I mean, the same Suetonius that I mentioned earlier, and Lucian, the satirist, who also made fun of Jesus. You've got these negative sources, and yet if they're going to say things about Jesus, that helps us against the mythicists. But let me remind you that these aren't the sources that critics are they're going to be fine with Tacitus and Josephus. They just don't think they tell us enough. And they are going to go to Paul. I guarantee you, the Jesus Seminar guys, the real skeptics, they're going to go to Paul. because, and they even give you reasons why Paul is more trustworthy. And when they say Paul, they mean those 7 books I mentioned earlier. But you use them, they're happy. If you throw in Tacitus and Josephus, they're likely to say something like, yeah, that's okay with me. Now let's get back to Paul. That's kind of where they are.
Okay.
And the Gospels, which were out for a long time, are coming back. And you see occasional articles now in the journals that even the Gospel of John is coming back for its value.
Interesting. So, bottom line, in your minimal facts case that you lay out in the past in your upcoming volume, you don't need these historical sources. You would still believe in the resurrection if we didn't have any of them, but you feel like there's a good amount and they add kind of corroborative support of the kind we would expect if these events are true. Is that fair, or did I put words in your mouth?
No, that's fair.
Okay.
Well, in the first volume, I do the 6 minimal facts as I count them, and then I add the empty tomb. So Mike Lakota and I called it 4+1 years ago, 4 minimal facts and the empty tomb. I call it 6+1. If you take those 6 minimal facts and the empty tomb, you will have an average of over a dozen arguments for each of the minimal facts, which is a lot from the ancient world. I barely even mention Josephus and Tacitus when I go through the arguments. I mean, I'm glad they're there. They're there for the people who say, no, you got to use something outside the New Testament. But if you use the creeds, which are frequently dated, the Jesus Seminar puts the creed of 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following. They put the creed, they say that creed was in existence when Paul set out for Damascus. Paul's unsaved, and that creed is in existence. That's the kind of source I want. I want a source from Paul's converted in 32 or 33 AD, one or the other, everybody. And if this is pre 2 to 3 years, 1 Corinthians 15, that's the sources I'm going after. Let me say it this way. Even if Tacitus doesn't mention the resurrection, he says that this mischievous teaching, superstition he calls it, mischievous superstition, broke out again. And Josephus maybe says his followers thought he was raised from the dead. I wouldn't even think about using them before the 1 Corinthians 15 and other creeds. 1 Corinthians 15, among the critics, the atheist New Testament scholars, like Bart Ehrman, Garrett Ludeman, and others, 1 Corinthians 15 creed, 3 and following, is way heavier to them than the secular sources. So the Mithras can scream, I want secular sources, and they tell them to take a hike. Josephus has 20 pages against these guys, 20 pages saying, one of them is this, Sean. One of them, he says, you guys complain because you think you're not taken more seriously by the real scholars. He says, let me tell you something. I'm an atheist. I'm not arguing for Christianity. He said, but you don't think you have a part in this debate. He said, you don't even have a foothold. In fact, you don't even have a toehold in this argument. That's what Ehrman says to the Mithras. So, I don't think we even need Tacitus and Suetonius. I mean, Tacitus and Josephus. But it is an answer to those who say, hey, just for me, do me a favor, humor me, give me some non-Christian sources. And like I said, if I'm right, 15 to 17, now what are you saying? That's a significant number in those days.
So what historical credibility would you put in terms of just ascertaining about the historical Jesus to Jewish sources? Obviously, the Talmud and the Mishnah, these start showing up a couple centuries removed, into the Quran now, 7 centuries removed or so. What credibility, if at all, do you think you would give either of those or both?
I mention the Mishnah in my sources. And I think that early passage about this fellow that they call the sorcerer, and let's keep in mind, sorcerer is not just a cult. Sorcerer is a false teacher in the literature, in the Old Testament. When they said this sorcerer is, we sent a crier down the streets of Jerusalem, and we said, if you want to defend him, speak now, because he's going to be stoned. And the very next line says, so he was crucified on Passover Eve. They don't tell why the change from stoning to crucifixion, but I think we all know it's a change from Jews to Romans. What's going on are the ways they do capital punishment. And those are valuable. I refer to that passage. I mention them there in the literature.
Okay.
It's a valuable text, but it's not a major one to fit in.
Okay. I assume when it gets to the Quran, by this far removed, you would give virtually no historical credibility
600
to it.
years later, 600 years later, almost to the year, 30 AD to 630 AD. That's a little far.
Did I miss any sources outside of the Bible? We talked about Gnostic sources, church fathers. We talked about Jewish Roman sources. You meant Lucian, Greek. Are there any other archaeological discoveries or sources we missed that are a part of this, or do you feel like we covered it?
There are a number of archaeological sources that are at least relevant.
Okay.
For example, whatever you do with the shroud, Ben Witherington, a top-notch New Testament scholar in evangelical and recognized across the board in New Testament, Ben has a book that he co-authored with a non-Christian Jew that they argue for the James ossuary, James's bone box, that with the name scratched on the outside. You're reading from the right to the left, and it says James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And I've heard Ben. He's I wouldn't do this, not because it's bad. It just takes a lot of guts. But Ben gave an argument, and he argues for the resurrection of Jesus from the bone box of James alone.
Okay.
And the argument goes like this: you almost never see brother of.
Right.
You have son of, not brother of. Now here's the point: if he's the brother of Jesus, and the bone box, he dies in 62 AD from Josephus. 62 AD. About a year later, that bone box is going to be there. It took about a year. So 63, 33 years after Jesus, they call James, his family. Don't forget, in Mark 3, Mark 6, John 7, his brothers are not believers. Jesus, his brothers are not believers. One of those is James. And what happened 33 years later? They're still saying our brother James was the son of our father Joseph and the brother of Jesus. And Ben goes, oh, so everybody thinks they didn't believe back then, but all of a sudden, what are they going to do? Are they going to ruin his bone box by putting a name on the cover that one of them believed in that nobody else believed in? No, it seems that James is still a follower of Jesus, which is the very thing Josephus says about him. So it's an intriguing argument. You've got some arguments for the the pool of Siloam. You've got some little things that are not the biggest things in the world, but they help. The Nazareth decree, it's being disputed right now. There's pro and con, but the stone that says that the anybody's guilty of grave robbing to be punished by death, and that was, as Paul Meyer says, that's not the punishment for grave robbing around the empire. So why was it in Nazareth? A little tiny podunk. I mean, to call it a town is an exaggeration. Why put it there? Is it because in the rumors in Rome? Is it because Jesus was from Nazareth? And by the way, it's signed by Caesar. So it's a Roman artifact. Now the discussion was it pertaining to Jesus? But that would be another significant one. There's a few archaeological ones that really come in here. James's bone box, the shroud, and that inscription would be the main ones. And you got a couple of people, like I said, with the shroud, they're going to poo-poo the thing before it even starts. They're going to say, yeah, not on my show, like that. So, but you got to at least count those things as possibilities.
Like the extra biblical writings, the archaeology is just corroborative support for the larger narrative. One of the most popular videos I've done on YouTube is with Titus Kennedy, and we walked through 10 archaeological discoveries for Jesus, and he wrote a whole book on it. And it's really fascinating how it doesn't prove anything, but it's corroborative support for the reliability of the Gospels and ultimately the resurrection narrative. Gary, I have so many questions for you. When the first volume is about to come out, we'll have you back to unpack that. But I'm really curious. You've done one volume, just one question. Actually, I have two questions about that, then we'll wrap up. One, have you changed your mind on anything so far in the research that you've done? Revisiting this, have you thought, you know what? I think I'm going to change my position on A, B, or C, or is it really just solidified what you believed going into it so far?
If anything, now someone's just going to be disgusted. If they're not going to believe, they're going to be disgusted I say this. But if anything, I have moved closer to the 6+1 points, 6 facts plus empty tomb. You know,
Okay.
Sean, I give over 20 arguments for the empty tomb, all given by critical presuppositions. Never do I say, oh, it's got to be there. Have you ever read Mark 16? I wouldn't even dream of doing that. I do the whole thing according to the way the critics argue. I have over 20 arguments for the empty tomb. By the way, the numbers have gone up from my last big publication to this one. In my own count of about 250 critical scholars, the number's gone up from 75% to 80% on those who agree with the empty tomb.
Oh, wow.
And so I would say if anything, I'm more sure than ever.
Okay.
And when I counted the number of arguments for the minimal facts, I average, if I remember correctly, I'll go out on a limb and try to give the average of somebody say that's not what you say. But I think I averaged 14 historical evidences per fact.
Wow.
14 average for the 6 plus the empty tomb. So I think it's much stronger. I can't say I've changed. I've probably gotten a little cooler on the shroud.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I get emails. I get emails for that. I'm a little cooler on the shroud, at least on using it. And Nazareth decree. I think that's not as good as I thought it was when I started writing.
Okay.
James Ossuary, I never was gung-ho on that. I'm open, but there's some issues with that whole thing. So the three biggies archaeologically, I have some questions there.
Craig Evans is really convinced. I interviewed him maybe 4 or 6 weeks ago, and he's convinced the ossuary is legitimate, lays out his arguments for that, interestingly enough. My question for you is, I published the book on the apostles in 2015, and just this past week got a renewed contract to do an update due a year from now. It's going to come out 2025, which will be a 10-year anniversary, which is cool. So I reassessing a few things. Some new scholarship has come out. I've switched on a couple things, like the likelihood of Peter being crucified, a handful of things like that. But I think the heart of the argument is solid. Is that something you're planning on talking about in these 4 volumes?
Which part? Planning on talking about what?
The deaths of the apostles and what role that plays in the resurrection.
Sure, because one of my 6 minimal facts is that Jesus is crucified, number 1. Number 2, they think they see him, and most critics add now bodily appearances. They don't believe, the critics don't believe in the bodily appearances, but they think Paul believed in the bodily appearances. That's a distinction again. 3, it was proclaimed maybe as strong an evidence as anyone is how early this material is. We have it going back to the 30s, many times over in the creeds. And you can have an argument for why the creeds are historical. So you can check that out. But I think some of our arguments here are really, really strong. But the 4th point after early is the transformation of the disciples' lives. And I use your book. In fact, I'm looking at it. It's over there on my shelf in my historical Jesus section. And it's really good. There's a number, as you know, better than anybody. There are a number of good books on the deaths of the apostles or what happened after. Yours is the best one for sure. And I cite others, but I cite it liberally. So it fits in because now the way I argue for reliability is on the transformation. I argue that the disciples were willing to die. Now, some critics go off on that.
Right.
Oh, willing, what's that? Well, willing's a lot if you're willing to die when your family's back somewhere else. And so I say willing to die. I agree with you in your conclusions that we can't prove more than the first maybe three, more than three. Have you rethought, or are you about the same on your view on the Apostle John with the 2nd century reference?
I would say I am slightly less optimistic on James, the brother of Jesus, mainly because the primary source is in Acts 12. So I think I listed it at like the highest possibility. I would just mark it
you gave him the highest.
Yeah. So I still have high degree of historical confidence because I think Acts is reliable. I think the way the execution is recorded, etc. But I might have rated that one a little bit too high. I'm not convinced about the Papias source. Oh, interesting. Good. I've had a few people tell me that I might have rated that one.
Who did?
I've had a handful of people say that's one area they would differ with me, which made me go back and look and think I might have overestimated it.
I think Peter and Paul by Clement, James by Josephus are. I would take any of those three over James and Acts because of the critics' view on Acts. Now, because I have to do it with the minimal facts, I have to use their conclusions. That's the way I set it up. Doesn't make me liberal, just makes me the point I'm making is, hey, I teach at Liberty. You know what my view is because you can see our doctrinal statement. That's not my view, but on your view, you still got a resurrection. So what are you going to do with it? That's my argument. So I can't be that strong on James by definition. Now, if James were in a creed, which Acts has a lot of them, Acts has more than any of the first 5 books, easily, the sermon summaries. Ehrman puts them 1 to 2 years after the cross. If James were in there, that would do it.
That would be nice.
To the other, but you still don't think John's there.
I'm going to go back and revisit that. I mean, if I thought John was there, it would only make my argument stronger if I had another martyr. And Witherington and Bauckham lay out their reasons for the martyrdom of John. I'm just skeptical. I don't know that I buy it. And I think there's plausible responses to their views. So I have set in this fall, I have some writing projects this summer. And in the fall, I'm going to start next spring. I've been, for the past 10 years, collecting books and articles, and I'm going to print it out and just pour through all of this. So I'm open to reassessing all of these if the evidence is there. But what I've seen on John so far, I'm not convinced by it.
That's fine. The big three are the ones we need because the big three are the same three that are present in Galatians 1. And all the critics, there's almost no critic. There are very few critics who are critical of what went on in Galatians 1. And then, of course, John shows up in Galatians 2, 14 years later with the second meeting. So John would fit into 2, but the other 3 are all there in 1. And by the way, I think that's the best reason for why the creeds deserve maybe first place in the evidence. I'd have to think about that. But maybe first place in the evidence. The creeds are so early. I'd say 2 things. In fact, I've just said this recently. 3 best arguments for the resurrection. I think the first 2 tied for first place are the creeds backed up by Paul's trip to Jerusalem. Because in 2 trips to Jerusalem, in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, I went over the gospel with them to make sure we were all on the same page. And they gave me they gave Barnabas and I the right hand of fellowship, and they added nothing to my account. So, and Bart Ehrman, of all people, he might have wished he didn't say this, but in one of his books, he says about that trip to Jerusalem, he says, where do we get closer to eyewitness testimony than right here? That's a great comment. Wow. And it's the same James, Paul, and Peter that you have in your book, along with the brother of, Zebedee's son, James. But you have those sources right there. So I think it's a great amalgam coming together.
So, Gary, we started this interview, and you talked about this endorsement of your book by R.T. France that was so glowing. But then when he wrote it, it wasn't quite as glowing. I just want you to know, I have you on record saying this is the best book of its kind. So I looked on the back, and there's no endorsement from you. So I just might have to use that on the update since you said it. publicly.
You take it. By the way, that wasn't R.T. France. That was F.F. Bruce.
Oh, F.F. Bruce. That's right. F.F. Bruce. So fair.
But yeah, I think that. Well, did you
fair
ask
enough.
did you ask me for one for that book?
I probably did. I probably didn't bother you, but for the update, you better believe I will. I'll reach out if you're able to do it. Would be awesome.
You do it. I'm willing to say that. I just said it.
I appreciate that, Gary. I can't wait. When is the first volume going to come out? You said it's done and edited. When should it release?
If there's no delays, that means trains and boats not bringing paper to the, if there's no delays, and right now they're right on. They're right on.
Okay.
This January. Coming up
this January. Great. Awesome.
24.
And then is the plan each year one will come out or 2 years apart, or you don't know?
No,
that's down the road.
They're actually planning it every 8 months.
Whoa. Okay.
And the first one is all on evidence. And it's just short of 1,100 printed pages. The second one, okay, I'll toot my horn here. As far as I know, the longest book in existence, the longest treatment on naturalistic theories, is Mike Lacona's doctoral dissertation, and it comes in at just under 250 pages on naturalistic theories. Mike's in my book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, is about 100, counting endnotes in both cases, 100 for naturalistic theories. My second book is totally on alternative theories, naturalistic and otherwise, and it came in at just under, this is manuscript pages. It's not out in page proofs yet.
Sure.
The first one is, but it's just under 1,100 pages.
11. That's incredible. That's going to be a wealth of resource.
It might be 950 in naturalistic theories, 950 printed pages. And I try to cover everything.
Wow.
Crazy thing. I mean, Mike and I did Elvis resurrection appearances. We did UFOs in an earlier book.
That's good.
So.
Well, I can't wait for that to come out. We'll cover it. We'll talk about it. We'll have you on. We'll push it. As you know, I teach the resurrection class at Biola Talbot School of Theology in our program. So as these come out, I will incorporate that. What's that?
I taught that course for I was a visiting professor for 15 years, and I taught it a lot. There were good students there. You got good students at Biola.
We do.
They're always inquisitive, always came after it, always wanted to debate things after class, and that was really good.
That sounds like our students. They're eager for that, and we look forward to it. Sounds like you're coming out. Did I get the memo right? You're coming out for a day to spend with our students in June?
No, Craig Hazen asked me to do it by Zoom, but I am doing it live.
Got it. Okay, got it. But you'll be there live connecting with us. Excellent.
Yeah, and the funny thing about it, the tough thing, is that I just finished teaching a PhD course for the whole week about an hour or an hour and a half before I go on to do that lecture for an hour.
Oh, wow.
So I told Craig, I said, I might fall asleep. I might be dead. I just would have taught the resurrection. I mean, no, it's not resurrection. What is it? Oh, it's a course on doubt. Oh. And this year they asked me to add a component. I have a whole PhD course on doubt. Great. But this time they asked me to add doubt and objections from the New Testament in the same course.
That's great. Well, I'm going to try to be there to listen in, or at least hear the recording when it's done. Well, thanks for doing that. Thanks for partnering with us at Biola. Appreciate you coming on, talking about sources outside the historical Jesus. For those of you watching, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got a lot of other interviews and topics like this, apologetics, worldview, culture, coming up. And if you've thought about studying apologetics, they have a great program at Liberty. We're all in this together, Gary, so check out Liberty Apologetics, check out Biola Apologetics. We are fully online now. Information is below. I'd love to have you in my resurrection class. Gary, always enjoy chatting. What's that?
I was going to say, we've graduated something like 75 PhDs in apologetics.
That's amazing.
So we've got some major guys, and a lot of our people, their dissertations have been published. We've had 2 published by InterVarsity. One guy never had a teaching position, and he got invited to come to a British school in the city of Oxford, although it's not Oxford University. He made it all the way to the last cut, and somebody else got the job. But I
Oh,
mean, this is his first teaching position. He got all the way to second place.
that's pretty
Um,
good.
so three Oxford profs on his committee. Anyway, you
Well,
guys have a good rep. You guys are doing a good job. The philosophy program there, doing a great job. They've got well
mm.
over 100 grads in the philosophy program at Biola.
Well, we send a lot of students. We
J,
don't have a
J,
PhD in apologetics, so we send a lot of our students. Liberty's one of the top I tell my students to go to. And so keep up the good work. Honored to partner with you, my friend, and I really appreciate you taking out so much time to join me today.
Enjoy it. Thank you very much. Enjoyed it, Sean.
You bet, brother.